Victor Sims, the Z historian. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shook the globe.
Health authorities have activated their most serious response.
Its deadliest day from the coronavirus.
The plans we have is to contain.
Africa has recorded.
But in some African countries, the impact was worse. Even before the World Health Organization announced the COVID-19 virus in March, many African nations were already battling another pandemic. Crippling and increasingly unpayable levels of debt. And one of those countries was Zambia.
In 2020, Zambia declared itself bankrupt, unable to repay debts, which stood at a crippling 129% of GDP.
It seemed normal at first, a good idea, something to boost the economy and uplift the lives of the people, to promote economic growth and bring about national development. But alas, with that good idea came chaos. Between 2011 and 2019, public debt in sub-Saharan Africa increased by an average of 27% of GDP. Worse still, in most cases, the debt crisis did not take place because of government spending on long-term infrastructure projects which could eventually pay for themselves by increasing growth rates. Rather, governments borrowed money upon borrowed money to pay off borrowed money. As such, when the pandemic struck, countries that had adopted the World Bank International Monetary Fund policy to grow their way out of the debt crisis floundered. Growth rates shrank, which meant that debt volumes ballooned. So imagine this, every time a country borrows money, it creates something. Not visible at first, not dangerous yet, but it grows. It multiplies. Interest, financing, refinancing, and the cycle goes on. And soon, it's an apocalypse. You are no longer controlling the debt. The debt is controlling you. But the first question is, how did we get here?
Here we go.
In July 1944, the United States invited its allies to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to discuss how to manage the structural crises that contributed to the Second World War. As most of the African continent was still under European colonial rule, only 3 African nations attended the conference, namely Egypt, Ethiopia, and Liberia. In total, the conference brought together 730 delegates from all 44 allied nations. However, John Maynard Keynes of the United Kingdom's Treasury Department, alongside the American Harry Dexter White, arrived at the meeting with 2 plans already drafted. The plans were tabled and formed the basis for the final articles of agreement for the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank. The other participants were largely onlookers. Fast forward to the 1960s, when formerly colonized African countries began gaining independence, most of them became members of the IMF by default. And in 1961, the IMF created its Africa Department. So how did the whole thing work? Well, initially, the IMF primarily operated by providing short-term financing in a relatively modest fashion through the Compensatory Financing Facility and the Buffer Stock Financing Facility 1969. However, when the so-called Third World Debt Crisis began to spiral with Mexico's default in 1982, the IMF changed its approach. Increasingly, it began to respond to requests for short-term bridge financing by demanding that countries radically change their domestic economic policies as a condition for approval. They say rarely does one size fit all. And while some countries experience improvements in social indicators, for others, structure adjustment programs were the beginning of the end.
The territory was soon to be known. On the 24th of October 1964, and after 70 years of British rule, independence was granted to the new Republic of Zambia. The Princess Royal represented Queen Elizabeth at the ceremonies. President Kaunda told the nation that there must be no color bar in reverse in independent Zambia. Our country, he said, can give a home to anyone who wants to live in it, whatever their race, as long as they accept that the majority must rule and that all people are born equal.
After gaining independence in 1964, Zambia entered into external debt almost unwittingly due to geographical factors and the structural realities of its inherited economy. To be sure, at independence, the country had one of the most promising economies in Africa, with abundant land, water, minerals, and natural resources. It also had some of the most promising African leaders and intellectuals at the time. Aside from visionary leaders like Kenneth Kaunda and Simon Kapwepwe, other members of Zambia's first cabinet included Mainza Chona, Arthur Wina, Reuben Kamanga, and Grace Zulu, who brought legal, economic, political, and administrative experience to the new government. Chona was a UK-trained barrister. Wina had formal training in economics and public administration. Kamanga drew strength from grassroots activism and mass mobilization, while Grace Zulu brought party organizational and administrative experience. These men were not your average Joe, they were the best of the best. Which of course leads to the second question: what then went wrong? To begin with, the apparent strength of the Zambian economy masked a deeper vulnerability. The economy was highly undiversified and heavily dependent on a single commodity: copper. Furthermore, it lacked a strong domestic industrial base. Moreover, under Kaunda's quasi-socialist ideology of humanism, the UNIP government pursued an ambitious program of state-led development aimed at reducing colonial-era inequalities and building national capacity in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Meanwhile, Zambia's emergence as a frontline state in the struggle against colonialism and white minority rule in southern Africa introduced additional economic pressures that would further strain its fragile structure. Under Kenneth Kaunda, the country provided material, logistical, and diplomatic support to liberation movements operating in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola, and South Africa. While this positioned Zambia as a key actor in the broader African liberation project, it came at a high cost. To sustain its multiple responsibilities and retain credibility, Zambia increasingly turned to external borrowing during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Initially, this strategy appeared sound. Copper prices were high and export revenues were sufficient to support both development spending and debt servicing. Borrowing was therefore seen not as a high risk, but as a rational tool for accelerating projects. Based on this logic, the state borrowed copiously and invested heavily in parastatals or state-owned companies, industrial projects, and social services, reflecting a broader post-colonial vision of economic sovereignty and self-reliance. At its peak, in the 1970s, Zambia's state-led development model was anchored in a network of powerful parastatals that dominated the economy. In keeping with his philosophy of humanism, wealth generated by industry and mining was to be used for the nation's overall development. Thus, central among the parastatals was Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, ZCCM, which controlled the country's copper industry, the main source of foreign exchange. Alongside it were key state investment arms such as Industrial Development Corporation, Indeco, which managed industrial and commercial enterprises. In June 1965, Kaunda appointed Greek Cypriot Andrew Sardanis chairman and chief executive of Indeco. Sardanis, who became a Zambian citizen at the country's independence, was one of the few white settlers to have actively supported the African liberation movement. As head of Indeco, Sardanis attempted to launch new ventures and encourage foreign investment. But he found that foreign companies, fearing political instability and restrictions on profit, were wary of investing in what seemed like a socialist African nation.
Get the president.
In 1968, Kaunda gave Indeco a major boost with the Mulungushi reforms. The reforms were a series of tough economic policies announced by Kaunda to increase state control over the economy, promoting Zambianization by nationalizing key foreign-owned firms. Through Indeco, the government acquired 51% or more shares in several companies to reduce foreign dependency and boost local ownership. To be sure, prior to the Mulungushi reforms, Zambia's post-independence economy remained overwhelmingly dominated by foreign interests, especially in ownership and management. Worse still, the mining sector, the backbone of the economy, was entirely foreign-owned, with the major copper mines controlled by the Anglo-American Corporation and the American-owned Rhodesia Selection Trust. Banking and finance were similarly in foreign hands through institutions such as Barclays, Standard Chartered, and Grindlays. And by 1968, only a small share of bank credit was reaching Zambians, while most continued to serve foreign-owned businesses. Suffice to say, Zambia inherited an economy in which the most strategic sectors were effectively controlled from outside the country. It was this imbalance that drove Kaunda's Mulungushi reforms, which sought to transfer at least 51% equity in major firms to the state so that a greater share of national wealth would remain in Zambian hands. Under the Mulungushi reforms, Kaunda targeted roughly 24 to 26 major companies for state acquisition. These firms represented the commanding heights of the non-mining economy and were concentrated in sectors considered essential to national development. Following Mulungushi were the 1969 Matero reforms, announced on August 11th at Matero Hall in Lusaka. The Matero reforms marked a decisive second wave of nationalization that directly targeted the copper industry, the backbone of Zambia's economy, accounting for over 90% of export earnings. Under these reforms, the government acquired a 51% controlling stake in the Zambian operations of the two dominant mining groups, Anglo-American Corporation and Ron Selection Trust. Their operations were subsequently reorganized into two state-controlled entities: Nchanga Consolidated Copper Mines (NCCM), formerly under Anglo-American, and Ron Consolidated Mines (RCM), previously owned by RST. To coordinate these interests, the state established the Mining Development Corporation as a central holding body. But most significantly, the Matero reforms transferred full ownership of mineral rights to the state, replacing the perpetual rights previously held by private companies with time-bound leases, thereby asserting national sovereignty over Zambia's most strategic resource. There was also a third wave of reforms announced in November 1970, aimed at bringing the banking and insurance sectors under state control to ensure credit was prioritized for Zambian citizens, including those in rural areas. However, these were only partially successful, with large banks like Barclays and Standard Chartered successfully resisting the 51% takeover, though they were forced to incorporate locally in Zambia. Now you must be wondering, in connection to these reforms, where does debt come in? Here's what happened. In 1973, a year after Zambia was declared a one-party state, Kaunda moved to assert fuller control over the country's key industries. Largely frustrated that foreign managers retained under earlier agreements continued to prioritize profit over national development, the government terminated these management contracts ahead of schedule. At the same time, it accelerated the redemption of outstanding compensation bonds, financing this move through, you guessed it, borrowing. The government then consolidated its expanding portfolio of state enterprises under the Zambia Industrial and Mining Corporation. It was this moment that signaled the transition from partial economic control to a more centralized and state-dominated system. Simple, right? Wrong. With the consolidation of its portfolio came full operational responsibility, deeper financial strain, and increased borrowing. Under such conditions, borrowing was not always disciplined by broad public accountability or guided by long-term productive strategy. Instead, debt increasingly accumulated within a political economy that lacked efficiency, democratic restraint, and sufficient diversification. To be sure, as a practical example, in its early years, state-owned Zambia National Commercial Bank issued significant loans to state enterprises like Indeco, often following directives from entities such as ZIMCO and the Prime Minister's office to support developing national industries. However, these loans were often given without interest, effectively turning them into grants over time and leading to an accumulation of non-performing assets. Without a doubt, borrowing more money without fixing some of the country's internal governance issues and diversifying the economy only made the debt crisis worse. The 1968, 1969, and 1970 economic reforms fundamentally reshaped Zambia, but ultimately caused a prolonged economic crisis and huge debt, mainly due to two reasons. Firstly, by 1971, the government-controlled Zambia Industrial and Mining Corporation had grown into one of the largest conglomerates in sub-Saharan Africa, accounting for roughly 80% of the national economy. This high level of centralization initially delivered gains, particularly in expanding local employment and extending state control over key industries. However, these early gains were soon undermined by structural weaknesses within the system. Political interference became increasingly common, with managerial positions often filled on the basis of loyalty rather than technical competence, leading to inefficiency and declining performance. At the same time, profits generated from mining and industry were frequently redirected to fund expansive social programs such as the cradle-to-grave welfare model, rather than being reinvested in maintaining and upgrading productive assets. Over time, this combination of weak management and underinvestment eroded the productivity and sustainability of the state-led economic model. But what exactly was the cradle-to-grave program? I'm glad you asked. The ZIMCO cradle-to-grave system was one of the most ambitious welfare models in post-independence Africa, built on the idea that the state should not only control the economy, but also provide for the full social needs of its workers and their families. Through ZIMCO and its subsidiaries, especially in the mining sector, employees received free or heavily subsidized housing, access to company-run hospitals and clinics, schooling for their children, scholarships for higher training, cheap maize meal, pensions, and even funeral support. On the copper belt in particular, this created a paternalistic system in which a job in the mines meant not just employment, but an entire way of life. In the short term, it helped produce a disciplined and loyal workforce and delivered real social improvements. However, the model rested on one dangerous assumption: that copper revenues would remain strong enough to sustain it indefinitely. Later, when copper prices collapsed in the mid-1970s, the system became financially unsustainable. However, the subsidies had become politically difficult to remove, and as revenues declined, housing, hospitals, and other services deteriorated while the government borrowed heavily to keep the system running. And by the time ZIMCO was finally dismantled and privatized in the 1990s, the collapse of this mammoth welfare structure left thousands exposed to deeper poverty, insecurity, and social decline. Which brings us to the second reason why Kaunda's reforms led to a protracted economic crisis and massive debt. The second, obvious, and perhaps the greatest weakness of Kaunda's reforms was that they remained trapped within a copper-dependent economy. Moreover, they were launched during a period of high copper prices, which created the impression that the state could sustain both large parastatals and expansive social spending. But when global copper prices collapsed in 1975, Zambia's economic model was exposed. With no diversified industrial base or financial cushion, the country faced a severe loss of revenue. To keep state enterprises afloat and preserve subsidies, the government increasingly turned to external borrowing, pushing the country deeper into a debt spiral and drawing it into repeated engagement with the IMF. Although the early years of reform had brought noticeable social gains, These advances proved difficult to sustain once the economy could no longer carry their cost. Again, the government could only think of one solution. By the mid-1980s, Zambia's debt-driven economic crisis had reached breaking point, and the government could no longer sustain the subsidies that had long kept maize meal, the country's staple food, affordable. Under pressure to secure IMF support, Kaunda moved to remove these subsidies, but the political consequences were explosive. By December 1986, the sharp rise in maize meal prices triggered riots across the Copperbelt, leaving several people dead and forcing Kaunda to reverse course and restore the subsidy, even as the wider economy continued to deteriorate. By 1990, with inflation soaring and living conditions worsening, another increase in maize meal prices sparked even larger riots in Lusaka, accompanied by an attempted coup by a small group of soldiers. These upheavals revealed that the social contract which had sustained Kaunda's single-party rule since the Mulungushi era had collapsed. Faced with mounting public anger and a loss of political legitimacy, Kaunda was compelled to reintroduce multi-party politics alongside unconditional pardons for conspirators involved in the 1980, 1988, and 1990 coup attempts. But all this was too little, too late. In 1991, multi-party elections were held and Kaunda was decisively defeated by Frederick Chiluba and the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy. There was jubilation and a sigh of relief across the country as Chiluba, a gifted orator and former unionist, took over the reins of power. Finally, the hour had come and Zambia was free. Or was it? Following the 1991 MMD victory, Zambia entered its third republic as a multi-party democracy. However, the jubilation and relief were short-lived, and the hour that had come would be one of disaster. To be sure, the new MMD government faced a desperate situation. Hundreds of state-owned parastatals companies were losing millions of dollars every day, and the government lacked the capacity to resuscitate them. In response, Chiluba and the MMD launched one of the fastest and most controversial privatization programs in modern history. More than 250 state enterprises were sold in just 6 years between 1992 and 1998, including companies in transport, retail, manufacturing, and brewing. The most controversial case was ZCCM, the crown jewel of the economy, which had become difficult to sell after years of underinvestment, operational decline, and low global copper prices.
We will ensure as government that not only do we keep the promises, but we work as responsibly as possible to ensure that we succeed.
The Zambian government, Bishop, sold the copper mines in northern Zambia to an outside consortium for $25 million. The copper mines for $25 million because they couldn't manage to keep them. The company that came in and took over the Zambian copper mines in 3 months made a profit of $75 million. They did not pay the Zambian government upfront in cash for the mines. They were going to pay them over a period of time. Here we have this company that has an understanding of how things work, raised the money at the government's expense, took money that the company should have, the government should have been making, and gave it back to the government and said, we paid our debt in full.
Although privatization helped stabilize the economy and later contributed to renewed mining growth, its immediate social consequences were extremely severe. Thousands of workers were retrenched. Moreover, privatization did not eliminate Zambia's debt burden. Instead, the MMD government continued to rely heavily on external borrowing to stabilize the economy, service existing obligations, and finance reforms under IMF and World Bank programs. In effect, while the structure of the economy changed, the dependence on external finance remained, embedding Zambia even deeper within a cycle of debt that would shape its economic trajectory into the 2000s. At the start of the 2000s, Zambia was officially one of the most heavily indebted countries in the world. Its external debt stock had reached approximately $6.5 to $7 billion, equivalent to well over 150% of GDP, while debt servicing consumed a significant share of government revenues, often more than was being spent on key social sectors such as health and education. A turning point came when Zambia qualified for major international debt relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries (HIPC) initiative, supported by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. By 2005, Zambia reached HIPC completion point. And by 2006, roughly $3.8 to $4 billion of its external debt had been cancelled. This dramatically reduced the country's debt burden and cut annual debt servicing costs, freeing up resources for public investment. However, this moment of relief marked not the end of Zambia's debt story, but a reset. With a cleaner balance sheet and improved international standing, Zambia regained access to external financing and began borrowing again, this time increasingly from private capital markets. The government issued Eurobonds, expanded bilateral borrowing, and financed large-scale infrastructure projects. Eurobonds are simply loans taken from global investors or fast money, but with high long-term costs. The name is actually a misnomer, as it does not mean these bonds come from Europe. It simply means a bond issued outside the country's own currency and market. When a country issues Eurobonds, the money usually comes from large international financial players and asset managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, JP Morgan Chase, and Goldman Sachs. These institutions invest on behalf of pension funds, governments, and wealthy clients, have higher returns, and apply even greater pressure than institutions such as the IMF. Thanks to Eurobonds, by the late 2000s, debt levels were once again on an upward trajectory. At the same time, it financed ambitious infrastructure programs such as the Link Zambia 8000 road project, major energy investments like the Kariba North Bank extension and Iteji-Teji hydropower project, and upgrades to key airports including Kenneth Kaunda International Airport in Lusaka and Simon Mwansa Kapwepwe Airport in Ndola. Much of this expansion was also supported by bilateral loans, particularly from Chinese lenders tied to construction and development projects. While these investments aimed to modernize the economy and address critical infrastructure gaps, they were largely debt-financed, contributing to a steady rise in Zambia's debt levels. After 2018, warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Credit rating agencies downgraded Zambia's debt, investor confidence declined, and the cost of borrowing rose sharply. Debt servicing began to consume a growing share of government revenues, crowding out spending on essential services and development. Despite continued economic growth on paper, liquidity pressures intensified, and the government struggled to meet its external obligations on time. Thus, by the time the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, Zambia was already in a crisis.
In a statement issued on Thursday, Dr. Msokotwane clarified government's position as the country approaches the final stages of the IMF's...
By 2026, Zambia's debt story had entered a new phase. The country was no longer in the full-blown default crisis that erupted in 2020. It had restructured most of the external debt targeted under the process, completed the final review of its 38-month IMF program, and even regained a degree of market confidence after ratings upgrades in late 2025.
Zambia's debt-related spending dropped by 3.5 billion kwacha month-on-month in January, even as the Treasury increased overall releases, offering the clearest evidence yet that debt restructuring is translating into real fiscal relief. According to figures released by Finance Minister Dr. Stumbeko Msokotwane, total Treasury disbursements rose to 23.2 billion kwacha in January 2026, up from 22.1 billion kwacha in December 2025. But the share absorbed by the debt service and arrears fell sharply from about 10.9 billion kwacha in December to 7.4 billion kwacha in January. That shift marks a turning point in Zambia's public finances.
So here's the irony at the end of our story. Zambia survived the collapse, but not the burden. The default years may be over, yet the debt still shadows the state. In other words, Zambia is no longer fighting a debt apocalypse. It is now fighting to manage the consequences of having lived with it for so long. And so the final question is not whether the last debt apocalypse is over, but whether the country will build the strength, discipline, and resilience to prevent the debt apocalypse from happening again.